Crescendo of Violence is an RPG written by Alan Barr and illustrated by Andrew Thompson. It was published by Osprey Games in 2022. It bills itself as a neon noir role-playing game, and you play as one kind of struggling soul or another in a wildly imaginative New York City in 2093. It stars Brad Pitt. All throughout the book, you're going to see the trappings and the hallmarks of the cyberpunk genre, from cybernetic implants to hacking to gangs, mobs, and corrupt police in a grungy megalopolis. But the author makes some important distinctions that will be discussed in this video. Before that, though, I have to mention the fact that I've reviewed a couple of the author Alan Barr's games on this channel, both Tiny Dungeon and Tiny Frontiers, which are part of his Tiny D6 ecosystem, which includes a ton of different genre treatments that use the same underlying ultra-light rules system. I have to mention this because Crescendo of Violence is not Tiny D6. It's a completely different approach that's much more complex and has a few really interesting mechanics that make up for the few deficiencies I've found in this book, all of which I'll unpack in this video. This video is sponsored by The Dread of Night, an RPG that puts heavy emphasis on cooperation as hunters are pitted against large and unpredictable threats on the continent of Gradina. Where once there was peace and harmony in the land, monsters and magic have risen almost out of nowhere and threaten to destroy the land forever. As a hunter, you work and hunt by season and spend your off time recovering and rebuilding your party. Combat in the game takes the Powered by the Apocalypse rules framework to the next level with a deep but easy to understand system. Each of the hunter classes is inspired by various dark fantasy and magic-oriented media, including Berserk, Lord of the Rings, Demon Slayer, Shadow of the Colossus, Wizard of Legend, The Witcher, Dark Souls, Darkest Dungeon, and Castlevania. And stretch goals for this project include classes inspired by even more fantasy media, including Avatar: The Last Airbender, Kingdom Hearts, and Naruto. Back The Dread of Night on Kickstarter today. Probably the best way to describe the setting of Crescendo of Violence is to use the author's own words. Quote, "Welcome to Crescendo of Violence, a jazz and cinema-inspired role-playing game that blends heroic bloodshed and neon noir into an action-packed, high-octane and improvisational wire and gun-fu role-playing experience set in a cybered-up retro future dystopia." The most important part of that description is that it doesn't say cyberpunk. The author says that at the heart of cyberpunk is a focus of life at the bottom struggling to defeat corporate power in a dystopian world where the government has failed. This game has virtually all of those things, except you're not really fighting megacorps. Instead, there's a plurality of factions in the city. Megacorporations are in play, but they share the world with these other factions, and you don't live under their boot. The timeline is pretty important to read for both GMs and players if you really want to get your arms around this nuanced genre. Long story short, the world descended into multiple world wars while technology simultaneously got more advanced in a number of fields. The most world-changing technology was unlimited energy derived from a technology called drift generators. In addition to that, there is the wet net, a wireless distribution technology that provides energy effortlessly to everywhere in the world, an unhackable currency system known as a fiscal token, which takes several forms before finally settling into one sort of denomination, repel tech, which basically allows for hovercraft and other anti-gravity applications, and most importantly of all, a governing AI known as Logos. Logos is really the bedrock of stability on planet Earth, and its infallibility and good intentions are not questioned in the game or by the author. It's really the reason why this game isn't cyberpunk. It would be inaccurate to say that 2093 New York, Neo York, is a utopia. But due to energy and resource allocation being managed by this benign supercomputer, Logos, no one is really starving or dying on the streets in droves. As far as the flavor of the setting, it's supposed to be in a future in which clothing, music, and even things like organized crime have all come full circle to resemble the 1920s and 30s jazz age. But instead of regular jazz, there's this type of music called synth jazz. This is kind of hard to really imagine, but synth jazz, which is nothing like regular jazz, has two important features. One, everyone listens to it, and two, only humans can recreate it. So whereas AI can generate all other genres of music, synth jazz artists are unique and special. In fact, all entertainers in the city are afforded special treatment. It's a pretty cool idea if you can stretch your imagination that far, and the concept of Neo York is equally interesting. In 2093, it's the biggest city in the world. Due to having rights to drift generators, it's become a hub of free energy for any city that is connected to it. So cities use rappel tech to literally float on islands all the way to the east coast of the United States and connect to this city's grid. One of my biggest disappointments with the game's presentation is the complete lack of maps. I would have loved a definitive map showing the foreign city islands parked off the coast and connecting with the mainland city to create this monstrosity. This list of districts, as they're called, is pretty fun, but it's completely up to the GM to flesh any of them out if they want to use them. There are literally 5 Italian mob families, each with their own briefly described style and flavor of criminal operation. Then there's the equally brief mention of Yakuza, which in this world are semi-legal community do-gooders, as well as the Triads, who are honorless, murderous thugs. As for the police, forget about it. The whole department is hopelessly corrupt from top to bottom. So here's the thing. Although this game is not cyberpunk in a lot of ways, nor is it trying to be, there are still megacorps. The author describes 7 of them, in fact, and some with more love and attention than the mobs. But it should be noted that the heyday of the megacorp has passed, and as a GM, you're expected not to depict any of these companies as ruling the roost. Personally, I have found Alan Barr's tiny D6 system to be a classic in terms of its simplicity and ease of use, but its biggest detractors tend to complain that it's just too simple. Well, Mr. Barr's answer to that in this game is pretty remarkable and elegant, I have to say. First of all, no D6s. You have 8 so-called paths, which are your main stats that inherently describe how you will approach and solve a test or challenge, and those are described right here. Each of these paths is rated 1 to 5, and that number tells you how many D10s you can throw when using that path. So we're talking about a D10 dice pool system. On any throw, you keep the highest number and compare that against the difficulty of the test, which can be rated from 1 to 10. If your highest roll meets or exceeds the difficulty, you pass the test. If your highest is a 1, you automatically fail. If you roll a 10, it's an automatic success. One of the brilliant things about difficulty numbers being scaled from 1 to 10 is that most people already inherently use that scale all the time in real life. So for both GM and player, it's just deeply intuitive to use when assessing or understanding the difficulty of a task. For opposed tests, both sides roll their favored path, and the higher result is the winner. If there is a tie, the second highest of both rolls are compared, and so on. Bonuses and penalties to rolls are almost always in the form of adding or subtracting the number of D10s in the dice pool that you're rolling. The minimum for a throw, no matter what, is 1 D10, and the max is 10 D10. One of the most interesting things about combat and confrontations in the game is the spotlight mechanic. Instead of rolling initiative and determining turn order or anything like that, everyone at the table just passes the spotlight to the character who is most likely to have the next action. You really have to think of this in cinematic terms, as in, where does the camera point to next? If you think in terms of simulationist combat, min-maxing, or trying to win the game of Crescendo of Violence, the spotlight approach, I think, would break down almost instantly. Everyone at the table has to truly be in it for the overall collaborative story, not just their character getting what they want. And really, the single most interesting and unique aspect of this game's rules is the action tokens. Every player gets 3 action tokens at the start of a session: a green, a yellow, and a red. There are all kinds of places in the rules where you're being coerced into spending these tokens. A green token gives you a huge 2d10 bonus to a throw, yellow doesn't do anything, and a red gives you a minus 2d10. Once you've spent all 3 tokens, you immediately get them all back, which means at any given time you always have a token to spend. And spending one of the green or red ones means you have to kind of explain how or why that bonus or penalty happens in the fiction. To quote the author, "The tokens are there to help prompt those bits of the story for you. They represent a non-random, pre-planned narrative impact that you get to spend as a player." The tokens actually come into play when using a lot of the different talents, which I'll get to in a minute. So I think the big question becomes, if you're expected to just hand the spotlight off to whoever, and you're constantly spending tokens, and a third of the time they give you a gnarly negative 2d10 penalty, aren't you going to end up dead? And the answer is, when you take damage and the attacker's damage roll is over your resolute path rating, you take one kind of harm or another, but you don't die, usually. Sessions are broken up into 5 acts, and you can only die in the big confrontation act of a session, where a death would actually have the maximum narrative impact. Momentum is another metacurrency that you get by rolling a 10, spending precious reserve points, or gain during a downtime action. You spend momentum to affect a scene in a number of ways that are beneficial to you. You can hoard up to 5 momentum. Reserves are another metacurrency that are only replenished at the beginning of each game session. It's interesting that between momentum, reserves, and those tokens, there's a lot of meta going on. If you include the internal logic of the spotlight mechanic, gameplay is rather notably squishy and sort of gonzo, really mostly in favor of the player. And this is by design. The author states that he wanted to make a cinematic experience. This as opposed to something like the OSR ideal, where players have to sort of grit their teeth and be ready for death at every turn. With the concept of heat, the GM will implement some negative narrative element on one PC or the group at either the beginning of a session or at the end of a session to be implemented at the next session, all based on the heat rating of individual factions. The heat mechanic is a good way of showing how this game is trying not to be a cyberpunk game. Like I mentioned a minute ago, there are megacorporations, but really the city's power structure is a plurality. Instead of fighting monolithic corps that control everything, your problems can come from a multitude of sources. The story structure is actually another really interesting design feature in this game. The idea is that the GM wants to divide any given session into 5 acts. An intro that lays out the stakes and the major players. Then Act 1, where the inciting incident occurs. Act 2 is where everything begins to build into a final confrontation, and this is the meat of the session. Act 3 is the big finale, most likely a shootout or big chase or something. And finally, an outro where heat points are assessed and everyone discusses where they'd like the story to go for the next session, or how the campaign went if the whole thing is finished. There's pretty decent guidance here on how to handle each of these acts, and I thought it was a very nice tool for the GMs to use to manage the pace of a session. And not just GMs, really. If the players are cognizant of this 5-act structure, they can tailor their choices and their narrative contribution to fit the flow of the session. As I mentioned, it's in Act 3, the finale part of each session, where PCs can actually die. Where you might normally just get knocked unconscious, you would die instead, except if another player has an immediate green token to spend to bring you back into the fight. Character creation kind of comes up a little bit later in the book here. The process starts with coming up with the softer, more narrative details of your character. Then you get down to the mechanical aspects, of which there are only 3. Step 1 here is to choose an origin. There are 5 in total, and each comes with different starting core stat or path ratings, as well as other little mechanical features. There are naturals, who are just naturally born, bioroids, who are manufactured machines that appear as human, clones, which are usually designed and grown for a specific purpose, cyborgs, which are part machine, part human, and finally Gen G, humans with sometimes dramatic genetic modifications. The second thing you pick is your profession, of which there are 7. This is by far the meatiest choice that you make for your character because it determines your starting talents and shapes your character concept via a number of questions. You can be a criminal, a hacker, a holostar, an investigator, a musician, a suit, or a veteran. The thing is, no matter what you choose, the idea is that your character is, quote, on the outs. They're a talented, above average individual in society for one reason or another, but something has caused them to be pushed to the fringes of society. The third big thing that you sort for your character mechanically is their talents. You choose a couple to start with depending on what profession you've chosen, but over time you can buy new talents or level up existing talents. A ranked talent can never have more than 3 ranks. The talent description tells you how its effect is amplified with more ranks. These talents are where you get to see the tokens and the meta pools of momentum and reserve really get played around with, and occasionally roll bonuses on certain tests. There are 37 talents in total. In the end, this is still a relatively rules-light game. Not as light as a tiny D6 game, but just by looking at the way it handles equipment, it really doesn't want you to get bogged down with the minutia. Your character is meant to star in a specific kind of sci-fi movie, and that's that. You start with an ear link, AR glasses. By the way, in this future, there are no screens. Everything gets beamed into your augmented reality glasses, and you see holograms everywhere. You also get a computer interface device worn on your wrist and whatever gear is associated with your profession. If you need to buy something, you just take a specific shopping downtime action and then make a successful wealth test by rolling your current cred rating against the cost of the item. You can see by this list of equipment that it's not the main star of the show. You get all the basics and not much more. There are also a handful of cybernetics that you can buy, and they range from cheap to relatively quite expensive. But really, it's just 8 possible cybernetic upgrades. The rationale is that, again, this isn't a cyberpunk game. The cyberpunk elements like cybernetics are more of a garnish on something else entirely. The other garnish is genetic modifications, of which there are also only 8 to choose from. One thing that is hard to disassociate from the cyberpunk genre is the decently constructed hacking rules of the game. It's fairly restricted in that only characters with the hacker profession can even do any hacking, but the rules and details go a little further than I would have expected. As a hacker, you can successfully hack a device or system by spending a green or yellow token as well as a reserve, and once you're in, you have a choice of 5 hacking actions. But if the device being hacked has a firewall quality, there's a chance of kickback. Kickback comes in the form of 8 possible defenses, and a device can have more than one kind of defense, and they all hit back at you at the same time. And that's it for hacking, but it's quite a fun little mini game if you're playing a hacker. Very reminiscent of Netrunner, of course. All right, here are my thoughts on Crescendo of Violence. Certain gaps in the artwork. First, let me say that Andrew Thompson's illustrations for this game are incredible, and the layout design is also top-notch, but I would have loved to have seen a map of Neo York, and maybe some things like logos and symbols representing the factions, and other small artifacts from this world, like what a handgun looks like. It might look futuristic, but also have an uncanny resemblance to a Colt 1911 used by a gangster in the 1930s. Also, since the 3 tokens are in heavy use in the game, it would have been cool to see an artistic representation of those, so you could print them out for the table or use them in an online play environment. In other words, certain kinds of smaller illustrations could have really clinched this unique setting. No open or third-party licensing. Since this is Alan Barr of Tiny D6 fame, I was sort of expecting an invitation for third-party creators to add, tweak, and contribute to the game itself. But this game is presented by Osprey Games in a very traditional manner, with nothing in the credits suggesting that Crescendo of Violence wants your input or your creations, officially at least. Unique city and genre. I love the concept of a jazz and neon-soaked mega city 80 years in the future that happens to look and feel like the 1930s. It's familiar enough if you are acquainted with the media touchstones that inspired the author, and yet different enough that you're experiencing something new when you play it. Fast cinematic play. The use of the 3 tokens and the momentum points that are constantly churning throughout the session, overlaid with the more precious reserve points, makes for a very active meta give and take for the players. The focus is on outrageously cool moments, whereas tactical combat takes a back seat. Actually, it's almost non-existent. With the spotlight mechanic, it's really more about creating cinematic scenes of an awesome movie that will never be produced. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what does and doesn't make a cyberpunk game, and how you think Crescendo of Violence fits into that framework. Also, if you'd like to keep the channel going, please consider joining my Patreon. Links for everything are below. Thanks for watching. See ya.